Hey, my friend, welcome back to the Profitable Writer Podcast. It's been a few months since I've released a new episode of this show, but I've got some exciting changes in store, and I wanted to give you a rundown of what to expect as we move forward. Let's start out here. Let's begin with a little bit of a history lesson. So, I started doing the Daily Writer podcast in 2020, specifically in December of 2020, after doing a few years of other shows that were titled things like Born to Create, Smart Business Writing. I had a show way back when, starting in, I think, 2013, called The Artist Suitcase. That show is actually so old that it's not even in the archives anymore. But I've done all kinds of podcasts over the years. And even though I really enjoyed exploring aspects of creativity and business writing in those other shows, back in 2020, I wanted to do a short daily show that was directly aimed at helping writers get the work done. So the Daily Writer podcast ran for a few years, but I noticed something really interesting in those few years, and that was a lot of people were asking me about my journey from being a college professor to becoming a full-time ghostwriter, which is kind of a strange career transition. People switch jobs all the time, but it's not often that you hear of somebody who goes from teaching college for a long time, and I did that job for 17 years and I loved it. But you don't hear about people switching from that career to ghostwriting, which seems like a completely different ball of wax. But people were asking me about that all the time. And so I decided to focus more on the business aspects of writing. And so because of that, I changed the podcast to The Profitable Writer, which of course has been focused on helping writers build their business and make money. And I also changed my Daily Writer membership group to The Profitable Writer. Oh, somebody sent me a text here. They'll have to wait because I'm recording a podcast episode. As you can tell, this is kind of a no frills podcast. So I'm just recording live and whatever happens, happens. So anyway, back to the story here. Earlier this year, I felt that the membership and honestly that this version of the podcast had kind of run its course. And I really felt a pull to revisit the broader idea that I had been talking about all along, which was helping writers become the authors of their own lives. And as I look back on my whole journey of helping writers and talking about making income as a writer and building a business and the creative aspects of, what I would call the artist's life or the writer's life, there's really one word that encapsulates everything that I have really tried to do, and that word is authorship. I think everything that I'm trying to do in my business journey and in my writing journey has been all about authorship. And I define authorship as taking charge of your own destiny as a writer. So authorship, in other words, is not just about writing books. That's one aspect of it. But authorship at its deepest level is really about taking charge of your own career, of your own destiny, and setting your own course in life as a writer and as a creative person. And the best way that I know how to serve you, and the best way that I know how to help you make progress in your life and your business as a writer, is to return to a daily show format. And of course, this podcast is only one very small piece of the whole bigger picture, which involves a big book launch next year, lots of other projects I'm working on, other kinds of things coming down the pike later on that I'm very excited about. And I will share more of those things as time goes by. But first, let me share a couple more quick things about where this podcast is headed. Number one, you'll notice that I'm keeping all the old episodes of The Profitable Writer as well as other iterations of this podcast in the archives. In fact, you can scroll down in whatever podcast app you're using, and you'll see that there is well over 1,000 past episodes. I think there's something like 1,200 or 1,300 or something like that. And that archive includes literally hundreds of interviews that I've done over the years. So there is more than enough material there to keep you busy for years if you're interested in diving into that material, which I would very, very highly encourage you to do because it's all really, really good stuff. Number two, the title of this show is going to change back to The Daily Writer sometime in the next week or two. And the artwork is going to change also. So please keep that in mind. The next time you go to look for the podcast, The Profitable Writer, and you see that it's not there, it's not because it's disappeared, it's because it has a different name. So make sure and check for new artwork. That'll be like, it'll show a typewriter. It'll still have the same familiar green sort of color. And look for the new title, which is The Daily Writer with Kent Sanders. And up until July or so in July, I'm going to switch over to daily episodes, but up until the end of this month in June 2026, I will release a handful of podcast episodes. And then beginning around the end of June, beginning of July, or so forth, I'll switch over to daily episodes. Now, number three here is, and this is very important, I'm keeping this as what I'm calling a no frills podcast, meaning that there's no cheesy intro music, there's no cheesy announcer voice, there's none of that sort of stuff. A lot of podcasters do that, and that's totally fine. I used to have intro music in all my episodes and all that stuff, but I've decided to keep this very, very simple, really very much like you and I are sitting down to have a cup of coffee and we are having a conversation. And the thing that really convinced me to approach my show this way is that one time I talked to a guy who had been in radio for a very, very long time, and we were talking about podcasting. This has actually been a number of years ago. And we were having this whole discussion about intro music and podcasts. And he said, it's interesting because, radio and, by extension, podcasting would fall into this as well. He said, radio is a format where people almost always are listening by themselves, and therefore they are perceiving what's happening on the radio as a conversation between who's talking on the radio and themselves. And people don't generally listen to podcast or radio in groups. And he said, when you walk up to somebody to have a conversation, you don't have a boombox with intro music and you don't have an announcer announce that, oh, hey, now you're going to be having this big conversation. No, you just walk up and you have a conversation. And I've thought about that dozens and dozens of times over the years. And that is the very reason why I've decided to not do any sort of big announcement thing at the beginning of each episode or have intro music or anything like that. This is just a conversation. This is just me and you chatting. It's me sharing my thoughts. And then because it is a conversation, I always want to invite you to reply to me. In fact, I would love to hear from you. And this is actually the fourth thing that I wanted to say before I wrap up this episode. You can email me at kent@kentsanders.net. I would always love to hear what you're working on in terms of writing projects. I'm very interested in that. So anyway, those are a few things that I wanted to share in terms of where this podcast is going. As always, I appreciate you listening. I know I always say that in my episodes, but there's a lot of ways you could be spending your time, and this show is only one of millions of options that you have. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to coming to you in the next 2 or 3 days with the next episode.